Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing a writing Q&A. So today, when you're seeing this, is the publication day of the paperback edition of The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, which is very, very exciting. I will leave links down below if anyone's interested in getting their hands on a copy, but I'm very excited for this to be out in the world. It has been out in hardback for the past year, but the paperback edition is kind of a bigger deal because, you know, hardbacks are expensive and the majority of people read paperbacks. I love this book a lot. I'm very proud of it. And yeah, I'm very excited that it is published today. So today I have a bunch of questions about writing to go through. Some of them are specifically about Montgomery Hurst. Some of them are about like writing and the publication process more generally. The vast majority of these questions I can answer without any spoilers for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, or indeed my first novel, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. But there are a couple of questions that I would like to answer in a way that will involve spoilers, so I will save them till the very end and I will warn you before I spoil anything about this book. I don't think there will be any spoilers for Hartwood Hall in this video. The first question I had was, how did you get a literary agent? Is it difficult? So yes, it is difficult to get a literary agent. Kind of every step of the publication process is quite tough, to be honest, like, not gonna lie. If you love writing and you keep writing and you keep improving and working at your craft, like, it's doable, it happens, but like, it is quite tough to get published and it is quite tough to get an agent. So I've had a bit of a wobbly roundabout way to getting published. I have had two different literary agents. So the first time around I queried, as most people do when they want to get a literary agent. I don't know how it works in other countries, but in the UK at least, if you are a writer and you want to get published, then generally, most publishers do not accept submissions directly from authors. They only accept them from literary agents. That isn't true of all publishers. There are some small presses who do accept unsolicited submissions. But in general, if you want to get traditionally published, it's a good idea to try and get a literary agent. So what you do is you write a cover letter, a query letter, talking about what your book is about. You also write a synopsis, and then you polish and perfect the first few chapters of your novel, and you send it out to many, many literary agents. If they absolutely love the first few chapters, they might ask for the whole manuscript, and if they like the whole manuscript, they may or may not offer you representation. And in general, it's a good idea, if you're trying to get an agent, to look for agents who represent books in the area that you're writing in, or who are like looking specifically for the kind of thing that you're writing. A lot of agents will have a list on their website of the kind of things that they're looking for and the kind of books that they like. So the first time I got a literary agent was not with either of these novels. It was with an entirely different book, which still lives on my computer and may or may not be returned to one day. We'll see. It wasn't historical fiction, so it's a bit different from what I have actually been writing more recently, but I was querying that novel for a little while. I submitted to quite a few agents. I got quite a lot of rejections, and I think I got 2 full manuscript requests and ended up signing with an agent. I then had that book and then another book afterwards out on submission with no success. And then a few years later, that literary agent left the industry for a while. And at that point, I had finished Hartwood Hall, and that was a very different experience because the book was a lot better, to be honest. But also, I think because at that point, I was emailing literary agents saying, I am a writer who has representation currently, but my agent is leaving the industry, so I'm looking for a new agent. So I think that probably meant that a lot of people read it faster because I had like already, to a certain extent, got a bit of a foot in the door. And I definitely had a lot more interest with Hartwood Hall than I had had with the book I was querying many years before. And then, yeah, I signed with my current agent for Hartwood Hall, and she has been my agent ever since. So yeah, I would say it is quite tough to get an agent, like it is competitive, and I think it's not just that it's competitive and that agents get a lot of books on submission, but also a lot of agents will only take on 1 or 2 new authors a year. So in order for them to take on you as an author, your book doesn't just have to be really good. It has to just be like their favourite thing they've read this year because it ticks all their boxes. It is a lot about personal taste. Like, they have to really, really love the book and be willing to like read it 14 times and edit it with you, and also know how to sell it to a publisher. So it is quite specific, and if you are trying to get an agent and you're getting lots of rejections, It might just be the case of you haven't found the right agent yet. It might not be. It might be your book. You might need to do more work on your book. You know, I don't in general think you should be sending your book out to agents until you have made it as good as you possibly can on your own. There's no point sending something half-baked because you'll just waste an opportunity. Is that useful? I hope that's useful. I had quite a lot of questions about like my writing process in general. My writing process varies quite a lot from book to book. I did make some videos about both of these two books, about like how I wrote them, which I'll leave linked down below, especially because I wrote these two books in quite different ways. Just realised I'm holding this upside down. But Hartwood Hall I wrote like in the way that I consider to be my process, which is much more methodological. You know, I came up with a plan, I went over the plan and until I was happy with the plot, and then I wrote a first draft, and then I edited it and edited it and edited it, sent it to my then agent, edited it, sent it to my new agent, edited it, it went to the publishers, I edited it. Like, I did a lot of drafts, and in general my process is to write a quick first draft and then edit the hell out of a novel. And I'm definitely someone who, like, I find it much easier to work with a book when I have something down on the page, so I like to get to a finished first draft as quickly as possible and then work out what all the problems are and rework it. You know, I work as an editor as my day job, and I feel like I love writing, but I also love editing, and I love editing my own books as well. And I feel like I am often better at working out what my books need once I have a first draft. The trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, though, was a much more circuitous process, because I started writing this book a very, very long time ago, long before I started work on Hartwood Hall, even though this was my second published novel. And I wasn't initially planning this to be a novel, so I didn't initially have a plan for it. I started writing what I thought was going to be like a short story, a novella, and then it got out of control. And then it turned into a novel, and then I rewrote it like so many times, and then I left it alone for several years, and then I rewrote it again. And it's gone through a lot of extensive rewriting and reworking, because it has shifted like what it is quite a lot over time, which was not the most efficient way to write this book, but I do love it a lot. Another question I had was, do you read the reviews on Goodreads of your books? Yes, but only the 5-star reviews. If you go to Goodreads, you can filter reviews by 5 stars. So I go to my books and I filter by 5 stars, and I read only the 5-star reviews, because I just don't think there's any point in reading negative reviews of your book, because, like, if someone didn't like your book, it's probably because it wasn't for them. Doesn't mean it was bad. I, in general, very much feel that reviews are for other readers. They are not for the author. Like, a negative review of your novel on Goodreads is not the same as a rude comment on one of your videos on your YouTube channel. A comment on my YouTube channel is meant for me. And maybe I don't think that is how everyone sees it. I think especially if your channel's a bit bigger, sometimes I do get comments that refer to me in the third person, which I find really weird. Most of them are addressing me directly. But like, I know that those comments are for me and I read them and go through them. But like, a Goodreads review is not for me. It is for other readers. And so I don't want to read the negative reviews. And also, to be honest, like, if you are a writer of historical fiction who has feminist themes in your books and queer characters sometimes in your books, then you will get some bigotry in your negative reviews, and I don't really fancy reading that either. I know that because I have occasionally spotted negative reviews, but in general I try to avoid them, and instead I go to Goodreads and filter by 5-star and just read the nice things, because it is useful to know what people did like about your book. You know, it's useful and constructive to know what particular things about your books made people love them, but I don't really need to read the negative ones. And I don't even read like the 4-star ones, because there might be something that someone didn't like that they've mentioned. Every now and then I'll filter by 5 stars and I'll come across a like 4.5 review with lots of criticism in, and I'll be like, no, you've ruined my system. I came here only for the 5-star reviews. But, you know, that's on me, not them, because reviews are not for authors, they are for other readers. Would you ever consider a new channel focused on your writing? I don't think so. I guess partly because, like, maintaining a YouTube channel is quite a lot of work, and I feel like all my YouTube energy goes into booktube, and I love that. And I also don't really know what I talk about, like, in terms of regular content, because when doing booktube and talking about what I'm reading, I read like a new couple of books every week, so I always have lots of new stuff to talk about. And I know I'm not just talking about new books that I'm reading, but I'm just not sure what I would have to talk about on a writing channel, because I like work on one project for like 2 years, and also because I don't necessarily want to talk a ton about works in progress, especially because like there's no knowing whether works in progress will ever see the light of day. Or whether you're going to completely change them into something else. And I think maybe that's tied into the fact that I don't really watch much like AuthorTube. I think I'm subscribed to like a couple of people who do sort of AuthorTube more than BookTube, but not very many. I don't watch much of that content. If I did, I'd probably have a clearer sense of what people talk about, but I don't like watching that content as much as I like watching BookTube. And I'm not really sure what I would have to talk about beyond the writing videos I do on this channel, which are quite sporadic. I would consider doing more videos about writing on this channel if people would like them. I don't do that many, partly because whenever I do writing videos, they don't get as many views, which is absolutely fine, and I understand why. Obviously, writing is related to reading, but is not like the same interest group necessarily. But I would be happy to do more videos about writing if the people who do watch those writing videos find them really, really valuable. Like if I make videos about writing and those videos get half the amount of views to a normal video, but the people who are watching them are really engaged and they're really useful for people, then I would be happy to do more. But I don't really necessarily get a sense of that. But let me know if people would like more videos about writing. But again, like what would I say? I wouldn't talk that much about like what I'm working on at the moment. So it would need to be more like writing tips and advice, I guess, but like I don't exactly know what I would have to talk about. But let me know if people do want more videos about writing, or if there's any like things specific people would like me to talk about. Okay, I had some questions like specifically about Montgomery Hurst, but all spoiler free. Someone asked me, how did you do the first outlining for Montgomery Hurst? What was your original idea and did it change? So as I mentioned earlier in this video, yes, it did change quite a lot. So I started writing this and it was going to be a short story / novella. I had the idea for the premise, which was, you know, an eligible young man in a small town in a rural neighborhood gets married to somebody that no one expects him to marry, and we follow his relationship with his new wife through the gossip of everyone around them. That was the initial premise for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, and I thought that that would probably be a short story or maybe a novella. But then I started writing this book and I got really excited about all of the side characters who were gossiping about Mr. and Mrs. Hurst, and then it kind of turned into a novel. I didn't really do any outlining for it on my first draft, or maybe I did halfway through, but like I'd written a good like 40,000 words of the book, and most of those 40,000 words are no longer in the book before I started outlining it. The kind of initial premise is still the same, but obviously this book is now about a lot of other characters beyond Mr. and Mrs. Hurst, and it's not just about the gossip about that couple, it's also about the lives of everyone else. And it's more that Mr. Hurst's marriage is kind of a catalyst for all of the other events in the book. So it changed a lot from the initial idea in some ways, but I also feel like it's quite true to the initial idea. Another question I had was, I would love to know which characters appeared first to shape the story when you first had the inspiration for it, and which characters you added later because the book needed them. So I feel like most of the characters in the book were there from the beginning, but they were initially all there more like as part of a chorus of gossip, and then they kind of became like more fully fledged in their own right, and like who was more important in the novel changed quite a lot over time. So in the initial like short story novella thing, whatever I was writing, I would say the main character was probably Mr. Ashpoint, and it was kind of about his understanding of Mr. Hurst and this marriage that surprised him. And Mr. Ashpoint, he is of the upper middle classes, and he's not exactly a self-made man, but his father was a self-made man. So he's kind of a gentleman, but he's only just a gentleman, and he does like work. He is a brewer, so he has a lot more money than like a lot of people who are the gentry who don't work, but he knows that he is not quite of the same like high birth as them, and he's really paranoid about it, and this means that he's really like obsessed with etiquette, and therefore a surprising marriage in the neighborhood shakes him more than it should, partly because he almost used this surprising marriage as a breach of etiquette, but also because he was hoping his own daughter Amelia would marry Mr. Hurst. So I feel like in my head when I first started writing it, Mr. Ashpoint was the main character, and Mr. Ashpoint is definitely no longer the main character, and Amelia, his daughter, is probably now the closest the novel has to a main character. I feel like if you read the book in its final form, Amelia feels like the main character. But in my head, she's not, because there are so many other characters who are really important. And also because, so in the final version of the book, the first chapter is from Amelia's perspective, which I feel like sets her up right away as like protagonist. But the very beginning of the novel came really late. I went through so many beginnings for this novel. And it was quite near the end of the process, like when I'd done a few rounds of edits with my publishers, that the first chapter came into being in its current form, beginning with Amelia, which I feel actually like gives the book a different feel in terms of who you care about the most. I don't know. But yeah, the characters were kind of all there from the start, but many of them have like shifted in importance over the course of the novel. I don't think there's any characters I added later. There are characters who I took out. Like there were plenty of characters in this book who didn't make it into the final book. You know, the dramatis personae at the beginning of the book is already like several pages. I don't think I needed any more characters than I have. But there were like several other families in the town who I stripped out later. Someone asked me what classics inspired Montgomery Hurst, and someone else asked what classics should I read after reading Montgomery Hurst. So there were quite a few different books and authors who were very influential on the trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst. And I think the works of literature that had the most impact on this book would be Pride and Prejudice and Emma by Jane Austen, Wives and Daughters in Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, and The Chronicles of Barsetshire by Anthony Trollope, which is a 6-book series all set in the same fictional county. Those books all had a really big influence on the trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, on the small town setting, on the role of scandal and gossip, on the writing style, I guess. Like it's purposely written in a style that feels a bit 19th century and is a bit wry, I suppose, like Jane Austen and sometimes like Anthony Trollope. And I feel like lots of the ways I look at like class and etiquette within it are quite influenced by those 3 writers. And also this book is set at the very beginning of the Victorian period. So it's 1841, just a few years after Victoria has come to the throne. I wanted to kind of look at the legacy of the Regency period and look at like how class is changing during the 19th century, because there are certain characters in this novel, especially a character called Mrs. Elton, and Mrs. Elton grew up in the Regency period, so all of her ideas are very Regency, and all of her like beliefs and her ideas about class and so on are very like early 19th century. But things are shifting and things are changing, and she isn't keeping up with them. She doesn't understand how the world is changing and how like power is shifting. And so that was quite fun to write about. Like someone who was coming of age in Jane Austen's world, how do they act in 1841? And how do they deal with how society's changing? And yes, I do have a family in this book called the Eltons, which is a name that Jane Austen uses in Emma. In the first initial version of The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, like many a year ago, I had stolen a lot of different surnames from 19th century novels, but a lot of them either changed or the characters got taken out of the book, until basically the only one left was the Eltons. But by that point, Felicia Elton and her mother, Mrs. Elton, were like so clearly Elton in my head that I kind of felt like I couldn't change their names. A great question, the next one. How did reading Annelies's diaries give you insights into daily life or social customs of the day? And did reading her diaries influence the nature of relationships for some of your characters? I'm going to talk about this question a bit here, and then I'm going to talk about it a bit like in the spoiler section, because I have some other things to say about this that I can't say without spoilers. But yes, so reading Annelies's diaries was massively influential for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, but in a complicated way, because I didn't read them until like I was editing the book. I didn't read them before writing the book. If you don't know about Annelies's diaries, they are absolutely fascinating. Anne Lister was a real-life historical figure living in the early 19th century, who was a female landowner, which was quite unusual at the time, and she wrote very extensive diaries, some of which were written in code, and she used this code to write about the things that she didn't want anyone to come across, including her thoughts about money, and including her romantic and sexual relationships with other women. And reading Annelies's diaries is hugely fascinating in terms of class history, gender history, queer history, and they're also just like a great read. I have read lots and lots of historical people's diaries for research for my novels, but never have I read diaries that are as gripping and fascinating as Ann Lister's, where you get to know her as a person so well. And it's fascinating because at times you really like Ann Lister as a person, but she's also like a massive snob. If you like Emma by Jane Austen and you find Emma's snobbery frustrating but also quite interesting, then Ann Lister's diaries are fascinating to read because Ann Lister was a massive snob. And I feel like the way she writes about class and people of different classes tells you so much about class in the 19th century. And the way Ann Lister writes about her relationship with various women is really, really fascinating, and definitely like influenced the way I wrote about certain things in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst. There's other things I want to say about Ann Lister that I will save to the end of this video. You probably had this question before, but since you're an editor, how do you see the role of the external editor on your books? Is it different from how an editor would work with an author whose day job was not as an editor? So I don't know. I feel like all editors work in quite different ways, and all authors respond to edits in quite different ways. So I feel like the relationship between an author and an editor is always like quite varied. I do think that the fact I am an editor probably gives me a slightly different like take on being edited as an author. Like I feel like some authors find the experience of being edited quite like confrontational. Like I think some authors feel like editors are telling them to change their books, and are making them get rid of things they like and stuff like that. And I never feel like that at all. I really like being edited. There are things that as an author you cannot see about your own work that you need someone else to see. That is just true. You can't always know how good your own work is, and you can't always know how effectively you have done what you're trying to do. Like when I was editing The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst with my publishers, I spent such a long time working on the character of Sir Frederick Hammersmith, who I love. He's a real favourite minor character of mine, and I had such a clear idea of him in my head, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with him, and it just was never working. And I'd have email exchanges with my editor, and they would tell me what they were getting from the character, and it was just like not at all what I was trying to do. And so I kind of went like back and forth and did so many different rounds to try and get him right, because I knew what I wanted to do, but I wasn't achieving it. And I think I've said before when talking about editing, like what good editors do is help the author achieve what they're trying to achieve, and make their book the best version of itself that it can be. And I really like working with editors because of that. And as an editor, I know, I guess, the value that an editor can bring to a book, but also like if an editor says there is a problem, there is almost certainly a problem. That doesn't mean that the editor's solution is the right solution, and an author will often find another solution. But like if the editor has said there is a problem, there probably is a problem. And I believe that very firmly as an editor, and as an editor who has worked with lots of other editors and so on. And so I also believe that as an author. And I think maybe also because I'm someone who like writes a quick first draft and does a lot of round of edits of my own, like before an agent or an editor sees a book of mine. Therefore, I'm quite used to like cutting bits out of my own books and moving things around, and I'm pretty happy to be relatively ruthless with my own work. Having had the experience of publishing 2 novels now, is there anything you have learned about promoting your work, or that you changed about the way you promoted Montgomery Hurst? Not really. It's quite tricky because so much of being published is completely out of your hands. Like, you can make the book good and you can promote it yourself, and you can do things on social media, and you can try and organize events, but like those things, for the most part, they don't make a huge difference in terms of sales, or in terms of readership. Like the main thing that affects how well your book sells, and therefore how many people read it, is retailer support. And for the genre I write in, like the main factor in terms of whether you sell a lot of copies or not is basically, do Waterstones like your book? Waterstones is a very big retailer of books in the UK, and for the genre that I write in, they are the main player. So there's a lot of stuff you can do yourself in terms of promotion, but it doesn't shift the needle that much. So I think really the things I have learned, like in between the two publications, is to worry less about sales because it's mostly out of your control, and to think more about like the stuff that you enjoy about publishing a book. And for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, when it came out in hardback, I did quite a lot of library events, which was so lovely. And I had such a good time doing those events in libraries because they were really fun. And I got to speak to lots of readers, some of whom had read the book, some of whom hadn't. And I just had like a nice chat with lots of people. And some of those library events were quite big. I think I did some where there were like 30, 40 people there, which is quite big for a book event. And then there was one I did where there were like 8 people there, but it was their book club. Like they had all read Montgomery Hurst for their book club. And so they'd all read it. And we had a really, really good chat about queer history and various other things. And it was great. And actually, like, you can't do that much on your own promotion side to sell lots of copies, but you can do stuff on your own promotion side to engage with readers and have a nice chat about books. What would you say if someone wanted to make a TV or film adaptation of your books? Well, that would be lovely. Of course, I would be very, very happy to see either of my books on screen. Personally, I feel like The Secrets of Hartwood Hall is more of a film kind of book, and The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst is definitely more of a like TV miniseries kind of book. I don't think it is hugely likely, I have to say, partly because like period dramas and things set in the past are very, very expensive to make. So they kind of go in and out of fashion, but certainly at a time when the economy is struggling, like historical drama tends to be made less often. It would be very nice though. I would love to see them on screen. Obviously, sometimes books get adapted to screen and the screen adaptations are not that faithful or not necessarily that good. And there are definitely screen adaptations I have seen of books I love that I really didn't like. But if you have a film or TV adaptation, it's such good publicity and marketing, and a lot more people would read your book. So even if the adaptation wasn't perfect, it would get a lot more people to read my books. So I would be happy with that as well. Are any of your books going to be translated? I do not know. I hope so one day, but we'll see. Again, like with film rights and stuff, this kind of thing is really out of your hands. So basically how film rights and translation rights work is that your agent will try and sell the film rights and try and sell translation rights, but really it depends on whether a development company or film studio or a publisher in another country has an interest. So my books would only be translated into another language if a publisher in a country that speaks that language wanted to publish the book and commission a translator. And I don't know how likely that is. Historical fiction tends to do a little bit less well in translation than certain other genres. Like there are certain genres which get translated a lot, and historical is not necessarily one of them. And both these books are like very British in some ways as well. The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst especially is like really intricately about the British 19th century class system, and I feel like that is of interest to some people from around the world, but I can kind of see that it has a less global appeal, and is therefore like less likely to be translated. Someone asked me, what author or novel would you turn into a reader-like next? Hartwood Hall being a take on the Brontes, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst being a take kind of on Jane Austen, although it's also definitely a take on Elizabeth Gaskell and Anthony Trollope, but I feel like the marketing has generally lent more into Jane Austen because, she's more famous, but there we go. I think this book owes more to Anthony Trollope than anyone else. Yeah, so the things I am working on currently are not necessarily like as in conversation with a particular author or book necessarily. I would like to write other things that are in conversation with particular classics. And I did, when I was like 19, I wrote a book that was quite Dickensian, and I haven't come back to it since, I have looked at it and it's quite bad, but I quite like the premise of that book. So at some point I may return to that book and write something a bit Dickensian. That would be really fun. But we will see. This kind of leads me on to my next question, which I had like 5 times, which is, when is your third novel coming out? What's next? What are you writing on at the moment, etc. And I wish I had any news for you. So I am writing things. I am writing, in fact, 2 books right now, either of which / neither of which could end up being a third novel. I think it's worth saying that when I got a book deal for The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, it was a 2-book deal. So I had like a guaranteed publication of a second book, but I don't have a guarantee of a third book being published. I very much hope I will have a third book out at some point. I'm working very hard to try and make that happen, but I have no news as of yet. And I hope I will at some point, but like, I'm definitely not going to have a new book out this year. I am writing. There will be more books. I have been writing like regularly since I was about 14, so I don't think there's much chance that I'm just going to stop writing. But I don't know when my third book is coming, and we will see. I have vaguely thought about like releasing some short stories on my Patreon, like just as PDFs, and you can sell like individual content on Patreon. So I would publish a short story on Patreon that would be like included for anyone who already supports me on Patreon, and then would be like £1 or $1 or whatever for anyone who doesn't. Because I do write short stories as well, and I have a few short stories that I like, and I have a few short stories that are like of an unusual length, and therefore I'm not likely to be able to ever do anything with them. So I have vaguely toyed with the idea of like publishing a short story or two this year on Patreon, if people would like some bonus writing stuff, I suppose. But I don't know. I still need to think about that, and I probably need to like check that logistically I'm okay to do that on my own. But that has kind of occurred to me as a thing that I might do this year, as I won't have a third book out this year. But yes, I will keep you posted. You will know when there is news. While I remember, actually, I do also have a newsletter that is like writing focused. Well, it's a Substack. I don't actually send newsletters very often. I send newsletters like 3 times a year. But if you want to hear more about my writing, then it's probably a good idea to sign up to my newsletter, because I will tell you news there as well as here. Okay, I have a couple of questions that I want to answer with spoilers. So if you haven't read The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, do finish watching this video now. But if you have read The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, please do stick around for 3 more questions. I'm not going to spoil Hartwood at all, so you don't have to have read that one, but right. Okay, so we're going to return to the Anne Lister question. How did reading Anne Lister's diaries influence the nature of relationships of some of your characters? So it's not a spoiler to say that Amelia, one of the main characters, is in a relationship with Clara, another young woman. That is clear like in chapter 2, but I want to talk about some other stuff to do with their relationship later, so I thought I would keep this more spoilery. So as I said earlier, I read Anne Lister's diaries while I was editing Montgomery Hurst, rather than like while I was writing it. And I'd written like many drafts before I read Anne Lister's diaries. And the kind of trajectory of Amelia and Clara's relationship was the same from like the first full draft. The one thing that was different in like the early drafts is that in the earlier drafts, I kept back from the reader for a lot longer that they were a couple. But at one point when I was rewriting it, I realised that that meant that you were always at a distance from Amelia because you didn't know lots of things about her life. And there were other things that I was keeping back from the reader as well, like her writing. She's a writer. You should know that because if you're still here, you should have read the book, I hope. Because in those very early drafts, I had kept back from the reader till like the 2/3 point that Amelia was a novelist and that she was in a relationship with Clara. Therefore, when I was editing the drafts, there were certain things about their relationship that I hadn't developed as fully as I wanted to. And Lister's diaries were really useful for that, and especially useful for the way like Amelia thinks about her sexuality and the understanding that Amelia and Clara do have and don't have of their sexuality, and like to what extent there might be other people like them, which is something that Anne Lister kind of explores in her diaries too. So in Montgomery Hurst, it was always the case that at the end of the novel, Clara marries Sir Frederick because it is easier and because she doesn't have that many options as a woman of her class and sort of lack of financial independence at this point in time. And Amelia has a lot more money, and her father's very wealthy, and so her options are slightly different. And I didn't actually know before I started reading Anne Lister's diaries that Anne Lister had a long-term relationship with a woman who then married a man. And Anne Lister kept up this relationship for a really long time after her lover had married. And they had a really tumultuous on and off relationship for a really long time. That if you read Anne Lister's diaries, like obviously caused her like such immense pain. And she had several relationships with other women as well over this course of time, but she obviously was still like deeply in love with this woman who had married a man. And that's something that happened before like the majority of the diaries that we have. So Annelies writes about this a lot. That was really, really helpful for writing the breakdown of Amelia and Clara's relationship, and also for like adding detail and colour and emotional depth to Amelia's decision not to continue her relationship with Clara after Clara is married. And I didn't want Amelia to have the pain that Annelies had, I suppose. And they were always split up at the end of the book. Like that was always part of the story. But I definitely think reading Annelies' diaries like really enriched my ability to write about that, and it was so helpful for writing more about Clara and Amelia's relationship, and also like how they see themselves, I suppose. I feel like that was a slightly rambly answer. I hope that made sense. But anyway, another question I had was, do you think Lord Sbridge is an irredeemable villain, and how did you choose to portray him? Yes, I kind of think he is. I don't think he was always unredeemable necessarily. Like in his childhood, talking about him like he's a real person rather than just a creation. But I think that Lord Sbridge has been turned into the person he is by the society that he lives in, by the class he's from, by the way elder sons of his class are treated and held up by the world. Like his strong sense of his own self-importance comes from the world he lives in and his position within it. So I don't think that Lord Sbridge, had he been born into a different family or at a different point in time, would have necessarily been an irredeemable evil villain, but he is irredeemable as he is in this book. Like, I don't think Lord Sbridge is going to go to the continent and reform. I think he's going to go to the continent and continue to ruin his family. I had a lot of fun writing him as a character. You know, part of what I wanted to do in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst is take like archetypes from 19th century literature and complicate them. So, you know, Felicia Elton is kind of like a Caroline Bingley figure, but you know, let's just stop and think about how lonely and miserable it must be to be Caroline Bingley. And then Lord Sbridge is like a, you know, traditional rake archetype, but like emphasizing how dark and sinister those kind of figures are, and how predatory. And that was quite like fun to explore, I suppose. Then my final question in this video was, if it's possible, I would love to see a video on one of your Excel timeline documents, as I can't get my head around what it might look like. So let me show you my timeline in Excel. I mean, it's really just a big old spreadsheet. So the reason why I wanted to do this in a spoilery section is because I've got little summaries of each chapter. It is basically just like a scene list. So you can see I've got various columns. So the first column is the scene index. Obviously I have a chapter number, but I also have lots of individual scenes within chapters, and I wanted to number them separately for my own reference too. And so the chapter number, you can see there's two numbers here. So there's a regular number, which is the volume number, and then there's a chapter number, which is a Roman numeral. So here we have scene number 1 and 2, which are both from volume 1, chapter 1, and then we have the next few scenes, which are all from volume 1, chapter 2. And then I have the date. So volume 1 is all July 1841, and the book begins on the 8th of July. And then I have a little summary of what happens in the scene and whose perspective it is from. And for Montgomery Hurst, this was really, really helpful. As you can see, the document is color-coded by whose perspective the scenes are from, which I found very, very helpful, because that meant it was easy for me to like think about the balance of different characters. And you can see that there are certain scenes which are referred to as omniscient / the chorus, which are basically like the gossip scenes where we're not like firmly in a character's head. And this like scene tracker was hugely useful for me, because I moved things around a lot in The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, especially in volume 2 and 3, like the middle sections of the books, things moved around so much. So I would use this spreadsheet to, you know, take a scene out and put it somewhere else, and swap scene orders. And I did that a lot. And this is my like final scene plan, but when a document is not my final scene plan, I usually have an extra column which is like notes or changes, and then I leave notes for myself on like what I'm going to change about that scene, or where I'm going to move it, or where I need a new scene for the next round. And you can see I've got like a thicker line for each chapter. So here are the 2 scenes in chapter 1, and then the various scenes from various different perspectives in chapter 2, and then we move into chapter 3 and chapter 4, and you can see that now the date is progressing and we're moving through July. You can see that at the moment the scene summaries are very, very brief, and I did like make them briefer as I worked on it and got to like know what all the scenes are about. So I think in earlier versions of this scene plan, some of the scenes were explained in a little more detail. So here we have a scene which just says Amelia walks to Clara's house, reflections on love, but obviously I knew what that scene referred to when it says reflections on love. So yeah, that is how my timeline spreadsheets work, and I find them very, very useful for me. Excel is a very, very useful tool. I feel like I use Excel a lot more than other writers. My writing group were recently astounded to discover that I do maps in Excel and like house plans in Excel as well. So for the Secrets of Hartwood Hall, I have a house plan that I drew for myself so that I knew where everything was, and it's in Excel. And everyone else in my writing group was like, why didn't you just make it on PowerPoint, or why didn't you draw it? Why on earth did you make it as a table in Excel with borders? But like, that is how my mind works. I think that's enough for this video. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, so thank you very much for listening. If you've stuck around to the end, do let me know down in the comments if you have any other thoughts or questions, and I will do my best to answer them. And yeah, I'm very excited for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst to be out in the world in paperback. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.